join their families and so on. So I thank all of you for coming to hear her in spite of those other distractions. She's going to talk to us today on Freddie Perlman and the Detroit Printing Co-op. I'll introduce her very briefly and then let her speak to you on this important topic. Professor Aubert is a graphic designer whose work examines the relationship between place, money, time, material, and methods of print production. She works both independently and as part of a collaborative graphic design group entitled Canada. Her partners there are Lana Kavar and Natasha Chandani. Professor Aubert comes to us highly qualified. She holds a BA in English Literature from the University of Virginia, which you know is an outstanding university, and an MFA in Graphic Designs from Yale University. You know how prestigious that college is. She joined the Department of Art and Art History as an assistant professor in 2008, but from 2013 to 2015, she was one of two inaugural Princeton Arts Fellows at the Lewis Center for the Arts. So to give you an example of how well known she is and how highly respected she is in her profession. Professor Aubert is the author of the artist book, 16 Months Worth of Drawings in Microsoft Excel, which was published in 2006 by various projects. In 2008, she began designing the quarterly journal Criticism for Wayne State University's Press, which is published out of the English department. Which in 2012 was selected to be part of the 25th Bruno Biennial of Graphic Designs in the Czech Republic. As stated above, she often works in collaboration with graphic designers Alana Kavar and Natasha Chandani. As part of that group, a group called Kandana, with Kavar, she made a series of projects that explore paper distribution and aftermarket paper and presented work in various venues, including the School of Arts Institute of Chicago, the Pays de Tokyo in Paris, and Moto in Berlin. So she is an international scholar as well. Aubert, Kavar, and Chandani edited, wrote, and designed the book Thanks for the View, Mr. Mais, published in 2012. And I know about this important work by being part of a grant review program that was very, very impressed with this work, and I think helped to fund part of it. And this work was about the life in Lafayette Park, a residential district in Detroit, which was designed by Maïs Devan Bode. Dr. Aubert has lectured at Columbia University, the School of Arts Institute of Chicago, as mentioned earlier, University of Toronto, Otis College of Arts and Design. She has received many international awards for her individual and cooperative design work from organizations such as the Tokyo Type Directors Club Award and the AIGA. Her work has appeared in various publications, including the New York Times, Metropolis, Wired, and graphic magazines, and in books on contemporary graphic design. So, but she has still found the time to participate in the Humanities Center's programs. She is a recipient of our faculty fellowship for last year, and she will be presenting that work at our faculty fellowship conference in April of next year, in April of this year. And she has participated in several of our working groups. So you see, you're the president of a well-respected, highly productive, international scholar. So we should be very grateful, and we are, for her decision to give this brown bag talk on Freddie Perlman and the Detroit Printing Co-op. So the least we can do is welcome her to the podium with strong applause.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming today. I'm gonna, so like Professor Everett said, I'm gonna be talking about this typographical labor, Freddie Perlman and the Detroit Printing Co-op, but I understand a number of people here are kind of coming from different disciplines, so I'll try to kind of clarify things or try to be clear about what I'm talking about. So I'll just start. So if you search in Google the term union bug, quote union bug, one of the first results to appear will be a Wikipedia definition for that term, accompanied by this image, which Freddie Perlman designed for the Detroit Printing Co-op in the early 1970s. A union bug, if you're not familiar with that term, is a small marker that is included on materials printed at union print shops. So they're usually pretty discreet. They appear outside of a border or at the edge of printed material, and they include the printer's shop number. Often they say something like Allied Printing or Allied Trades, an indication that all aspects of the work, of the printing work, from typesetting to printing to trimming and folding, were all performed by union labor. So this particular union bug, while it illustrates the Wikipedia entry for union bug, is actually abnormal, or it's like unusual, in that it calls for the abolition of the wage system and the abolition of the state. Usually, the purpose of a union is actually to kind of increase wages or get better working conditions. This is actually sort of like calling for upending the entire system. So it was designed for kind of an unusual entity, the Detroit Printing Co-op, which was part of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. And this is the group, or this is the sort of organization that I've become really interested in the last few years. It was the site of production of a number of visually surprising and compelling publications over the course of the 1970s, including the first English translation of Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, a Black Star publication, The Political Thought of James Forman, poetry magazine River Run, several issues of the journal Radical America, and Rebel's Voice, which was an unofficial newspaper by students at Cass Tech. So I'll show some images of all of those in a minute. So in researching the co-op over the last, I really started doing this research more intensely after I got this Humanities Center grant. So kind of, I've been thinking, I learned the existence of the Detroit Printing Co-op, and then I started doing more research maybe in the last year and a half. It has sort of sharpened some questions I've had for a long time about labor as it relates to graphic design, and specifically typography. So I'm sort of using typography and graphic design a little bit interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. But typography, for people who aren't maybe familiar with that, exactly what that is sort of the backbone of graphic design, and it's the, one way to define it would be that it's the considered arrangement of letters and words to communicate meaning, or like page layout, where do you sort of position the text? So typographical labor is often unacknowledged, sort of invisible, but it's really part of the, it's part of the kind of graphic design process. So in thinking about this idea of typographical labor, I've been thinking, what is it? What does it look like? How is it kind of experienced? So something, so what I start, like, I put together this, these slides this morning, so I haven't really vetted these first set of slides. I haven't really vetted this sort of theory that much, but I'm just going to present it here because I thought I've been thinking about it. But so I've been sort of thinking about how you could think about typography or typographical labor as existing in these three stages, historical stages. The first is like the longest one that was involved using metal type to typeset. So maybe this would go from like Gutenberg or like movable type up through the first part of the 20th century. Well, so yeah, or linotype, like when you have, so anything that's sort of involving like metal type or like a physical heavy type. And then a second stage, like would be like this sort of transitional stage where you're using a combination of paste up, like you're using metal type, but you're kind of working with actual paper and doing paste up and sort of it's sort of this stage that goes between this metal type and the digital stage. So that I'm just sort of referring to as this transitional stage. And then the last one is like the digital stage that we sort of exist in now, where a lot of typographical work is happening in Adobe Creative Suite software. It's just happening on the computer. It's a digital period. So I sort of just observing or whatever that there's a correlation between the type of labor that's associated with each of those stages and the kind of like what that labor looks and feels like and how it's experienced. So in the first stage, the sort of longer stage, you have this is like this like period that starts with movable type when typesetters had to work in close proximity to the printing machines, and a lot of times it was kind of the same work, like setting type was just like part of the printing process. So this is just an image of a woodcut of Benjamin Franklin's print shop. But for instance, like here's a print shop, and you can see the printers, the type cases on the side, those gridded wooden cases. And you were working with lead type that had to be, that was heavy, so it has to be pretty close to the machine that you're printing off of. And this is when you find a lot of women worked as typesetters. Here's an image of women actually in a bindery. But women worked in the printing trades, and then also there's like child labor was an issue because children and women had smaller fingers, so you could like pick out the type faster. Like, cause type is really, the metal type is really small. So on the political left, there's the sort of emergence of the International Typographical Union, which was formed to improve working conditions for typesetters and for printers, and it was a really powerful union, and like every sort of town had a newspaper, and then all newspapers, which involved printing labor, and so the ITU, or International Typographical Union, was representing those laborers. And when I first learned of the existence of the International Typographical Union, it was after I had already become a graphic designer, and I was kind of like, oh, it's so interesting that there was a typographical union. Like, it's not a printers union. Like, as a graphic designer working today, I really think of printers as sort of the typical like laborers, and what I do is just like, I don't know. I don't really think, like it's this other thing that I do, but it's interesting that it was interesting to me that they use that term typographical labor. And the ITU kind of lasted. It was strong for like a lot of the 20th century, and then now it's part of Communication Workers of America. But so then this sort of transitional stage that I've been kind of talking about is when typesetting would sort of take place on machines like the IBM Selectric or Veritype machine, where you would type out text on basically a typewriter, and this is all, like, I haven't actually done this is all based on what people have explained to me, so I'm sure I could be like corrected, but basically you would sort of type up text and then cut and physically cut using a blade, cut out the bits of text that you wanted to kind of arrange on a page. And you could use rub-off letters for text that was a little bit more decorative or like larger headlines. So you would do a combination of this sort of typewriter typing and then rub-off letters, and then you would bring it all together in a paste-up. So you would kind of set up your pages, or you would do page layout by actually cutting stuff and sort of using a light table to figure out where stuff was positioned. And if you wanted to like justify text, you had to actually physically cut the words apart and kind of spread them out, like count the characters and figure out how to align it using rulers and knives. And so this is sort of the paste up phase. But for the most part, like equipment and materials would be in one location, and then once you had this paste up, then you would photograph that, and then that would turn it into a plate that could be used on offset printing machines. So for the most part, things would probably be in the same place, but this is the stage when you see this kind of emergence of underground radical presses, like publishing, and this is the stage that the Detroit Printing Co-op kind of was in. Like, this is how they were making things. So, I will kind of talk about this more later. Here's just another example of someone doing paste up. But I'm also kind of thinking in terms of typographical labor. I thought it's interesting that, for instance, you could have the typesetting equipment, like the IBM Selectric or the Veritype machine in one place, and then a person could do the paste ups like in one location, and then they could carry sheets of paper to another place to get photographed and to get printed. So you start to get this like dispersion a little bit of the working method, the working kind of steps. So in the case of the Detroit Printing Co-op, they often would talk about how they would do paste up at the offices of the Fifth Estate, which was a kind of radical newspaper. So they would go to the Fifth Estate, do the paste up stuff there sometimes, and then they would bring their paste ups over to, or their mechanicals over to the printing co-op. So you start to just have that separation. This is a waxing machine. So none of these things are used really now. And so finally, like the current stage is where typographical labor takes place on a computer. So here you almost always have physical distance between the site of that typographical labor and the site of printing, unless you're talking about like inkjet printing, like there's a printer in the corner of this picture, or labor printing, laser printing. But if you're doing offset printing, which is what's used for a larger, offset printing is the method that's used for printing larger volume of like for books, or if you're going to do anything over like 500 or 1,000 copies, then almost certainly you're designing it in one location and sending your file either to a printer across town, or you're sending it to someone in another country. A lot of printing, happens in Asia. This is just a picture that I sometimes show when I've given talks before of like my sad basement, like workspace on the left, and then my friend in Croatia where it's really sunny. But this stage of labor, is also associated with precarity, like this sort of term precarity, where graphic designers or typographers can work anywhere at any time for wages that can be high or very low, and you have. For like most of my friends who are practicing graphic designers, you can often have many clients at once, and you can take your laptop anywhere. You can format images, code, email, and then send stuff to print. And it can be exhilarating, but it's also kind of exhausting. But I'm gonna focus. This is a picture of Freddie Perlman, and I'm gonna focus on his work and the work of the printing co-op, which took place during this kind of transitional in-between stage that I've just identified, or I don't know, I haven't really vetted, like I said. But so there arose, in Detroit, there was a lot of kind of underground radical printing happening in the 70s, but this was also something that was happening on the West Coast, in New York, in Chicago, in other places. So I'm interested specifically in the work of the Detroit Printing Co-op, and of Freddie Perlman in particular, because he had a kind of experimental approach to printing, collage, and typography. And so he's kind of I'll give a brief bio. He was the founder of the periodical and subsequently the publishing house Black and Red. He was author, translator, publisher, and printer of many radical books and pamphlets. He's originally from Czech Republic, and his family immigrated to Bolivia and then to the United States ahead of the Nazis who were coming in Europe. So he went to college in America, I think in Indiana, but then he went back to Europe to get a PhD in economics in Belgrade in Yugoslavia at Belgrade University. And after he completed his studies there, he went to France. And this was in May 1968 when there was a general strike and massive uprising in France. So he participated in that, and it had a big influence on him. He made connections during that time with the Situationists, and he came From there, he moved to Michigan, to Western Michigan, with his wife, and he had a teaching job in the economics department at Western Michigan University, and then he was, completely fed up with institutions and decided that it wasn't for him, and he left that job after 1 year and moved to Detroit. And here on the southwest side, he set up the Detroit Printing Co-op with a group of friends. And he died young when he was 51 in 1985. He had had heart problems all of his life. And he's really most known for his writing and publishing. For The Reproduction of Daily Life was one text that he wrote, and then he also wrote a book called Against History, Against Leviathan that's been very influential to kind of anarcho-primitivist thought. And he's not as well known as a printer, but he's definitely not really thought of as a typographer or a graphic designer or anything like that, although he was doing a lot of that work. And that's kind of the angle I've been taking when looking at his printing output, is looking at it from the side of design. So here's a picture of Freddie Perlman with two visitors in the print shop, and in the foreground, I think that's a folding machine. I couldn't find any photos of the actual press, the actual printer that they acquired, but in 1969, he and a group of friends learned of a printer, like an actual printing machine, an offset press in Chicago, that there was an anarchist press that was closing down, and they were looking for someone that want to use this offset press. And an offset press is like a massive machine. It's like, it's heavy. It's hard to use, but it has the capacity to print at a really high volume and pretty cheaply. So they raised. And the press that this person was getting rid of was a 50-year-old Harris press, so it was old and kind of finicky. But they raised $4,000 to buy it, and then they moved it in parts, like into a building near the corner of Michigan Avenue and Vinewood. And there's stories about how they just had like 1 day of training. Like this guy, like it's like operating an offset press is the kind of thing that you go to like vocational school and you do an apprenticeship for like 2 years. But they had 1 day of training by this guy. And I think they had some kind of manual, but it was already a really old press, and there are really kind of funny stories of how they were just like figuring out how to print on their, kind of on their own. But over the next decade, they would print tens of thousands of copies of books, flyers, posters, and pamphlets. And the structure of the Detroit Printing Co-op was basically that anyone could come in and print for themselves. They considered the equipment to be social property controlled by individuals who needed and maintained it. It wasn't actually owned by any one person, it was owned by the group. And the purpose of the co-op was just to provide printing access to whoever wanted to express themselves, specifically for like non-profit purposes. And here's a list of the guidelines that they wrote up. They kind of drew up for themselves. After they were open for a little while, they realized they needed to kind of set some rules. Mainly that the equipment is shared. They also were really resistant to being taken over by any political group. They didn't want to be like, taken over by like the Stalinists or there were always sort of like warring left groups, or not warring, but kind of like, there were different groups that thought that the press should sort of be theirs. But basically, the way it worked was if you wanted to get something printed, they would teach you how to operate the machines, and then you could print it yourself. And sometimes some of the members of the co-op would print stuff for other people, but I think they have a thing. The last point is, it's not the purpose of the printing co-op to solve the problem of unemployment, nor to provide business opportunities for enterprising capitalists. So there are stories of people, it wasn't like prohibited, but there are stories of people who would try to print commercially, kind of like, Palmer printing across the street. They would try to like do jobs for other people, but they were not, the machine was old, they weren't effective, they couldn't really they couldn't just make it profitable, so they kind of failed. But it ended up just being, available for people. So I recently curated an exhibition of material that was printed at the co-op during the 70s. and this was in Hamtramck at 9338 Campout Gallery. And the exhibition brought together a range of publications that were printed there, and the way that we were able to tell what was actually printed at the co-op was if it had that union bug on it, and it was usually much smaller, but the union bug would be kind of somewhere in the publication. And most of the stuff I borrowed from Lorraine Perlman, who's Freddie Perlman's wife, widow. So it was basically in one room. There's a little bit, there's a sort of smaller room in the back. But the aim of this exhibition was to consider the printing co-op as a site of design, production, and thought, where political ideas were shaped in part by the interactions between people and the equipment that they used for printing. So there were these tables with examples of publications that were printed at the co-op by various groups, including Freddie Perlman. And then on the walls, I had taken some details. I had done these very high-res scans of details of the books to just try to blow up some of the things that I thought were kind of visually interesting and unique inside those books. And those are like those posters on the wall. So here are some examples of Radical America that was printed there. These were publications printed by Freddie and Lorraine Perlman as part of Black and Red. So all the books that came out from Black and Red during the 70s were printed at the co-op. Here's a couple more. They did this kind of fold-out comic strip type of thing about Marx. It's The Fetish Speaks. It's sort of explaining Marx's theory of the fetish in cartoon form. And then this was one of the posters. This is just one of the spreads from a book. This is this is an image that appears in the Society of the Spectacle, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then these are all these portraits with letters overprinted on top of the portraits of quote-unquote revolutionary leaders. And this appears in one of his books, Manual for Revolutionary Leaders. So I'll show those a little bit in more detail. So besides Black and Red, some of the groups and individuals who made use of the printing co-op included high school students. This was a Rebels Voice, the official organ of the Rebels. That was printed by some students at Cass Tech, and I was really kind of excited about this particular newspaper because, in one of the articles inside is an op-ed by, I guess it's all op-eds by teenagers, but there's an op-ed complaining about the graphic arts program at Cass Tech, and that they're using, that they're sort of out of touch. And Radical America was published there, so and there's a lot of copies of Radical America, or a lot of copies of Radical America. The political thought of James Forman, for anyone who's familiar with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, there was a man named Carl Smith who was a member of the League who printed there. And they printed 10,000 copies of this book. This journal, this is an arts journal, River Run, was also printed there. This was a bunch of Wayne State grads actually did this. But a number of pamphlets and kind of reprints. Martin Glaberman, who was part of Facing Reality, had reprinted some things there. This was the Radical Education Project. Community calendar. And then this is Freddie Perlman, a pamphlet from Freddie Perlman. This is something that he wrote after he left Western Michigan University. When I saw that, I was like, wow, it really looks like contemporary graphic design. It's also, so this reproduction of daily life is one of his most read and most kind of widely circulated texts. And these early pamphlets, they're not necessarily so crazy in terms of printing. They're it's a lot of red, but they do get kind of more interesting. He's already kind of experimenting with overprinting and overlaying. And this is a pamphlet that I learned that I saw kind of more recently, and this sort of confirmed for me that he really is interested in printing. Birth of a Revolutionary Movement in Yugoslavia. It's a pretty dry text, but he's doing all this crazy stuff with the colors and the kind of graphics that he didn't really, it just seems it's like, it's kind of superfluous. And a lot of times I think of these sort of hardcore political people as being like, you know, anything like arty is a little bit, I don't know, like it's frivolous or something, but he's really kind of playing with color. Like this spread is just kind of extra, you know, so I mean it's not necessary for getting the message across to do this kind of colorful collage. And this has it has a printing bug kind of in the lower right corner, which I think this was maybe one of the very earliest things that was printed there. And this is I mean, this was just interesting to me because it's different from the bug that appears later. So I'll talk a little bit about Society of the Spectacle, and in case people don't know this text, it was a really important theoretical text that came out in this. I think the original French came out in the 60s, but the first English translation came out in the late 60s and came out of Detroit. And this text was really influential for people in France who were participating in the protests that happened in May '68. And this text was then kind of really influential here. A lot of people had to read this in college, or sort of were familiar with this text. But what I didn't realize was that it was printed in Detroit, and it was designed in Detroit, and actually translated by this group at the Detroit Printing Co-op. And this is probably the most famous publication that came out of there, although most people don't really even know that it came from Detroit. But and it also has this kind of an interesting story. Freddie Perlman and a group of friends that included Lorraine Perlman, Hannah Ziegelau, Bobby Auerbach, and Jane Wake, among others, they just met as a group and translated and printed this first English edition. So in the first edition, the front cover bears a black and white photograph of what appears to be a drab office building with a grid of illuminated windows. Because of the way the image is cropped, the edges of the building aren't visible, and it seems as though the windows could go on and on. And behind them, we can sometimes make out people, desks, stacks of paper. It's a little bit hard to see in this image. But then stacked vertically beside the image is the title of the book, printed white on black, with capitalized sans serif letters. And then below the title is the author's name, Guy Debord, printed in all lowercase letters, and there's a tiny $1 at the very top. You can barely make it out. And if we were to read the title as a kind of a caption to the image beside it, the cover suggests that the spectacle is people at work going about their business in this square, drab world of offices. And on the back cover of this first English edition, there's a full bleed image of a theater with row after row of audience members wearing 3D glasses. And this image is more iconic, and for many people it's immediately associated with the book. In the second edition, and then all later editions, this image would move to the front cover. And here it resonates even more strongly with the title of the Society of the Spectacle. Here is the people in the audience. It's all those people watching a screen, which is off camera. So it's sort of like we ourselves, who are kind of obsessed with screens, are the Society of the Spectacle. And this translation is on the title page. It says it's a black and red translation, unauthorized in Detroit in 1970. And you can see the printing bug at the bottom. Guy Debord claimed to be a bit unhappy, or later there's a letter that he's written where he says he's kind of unhappy about these quote-unquote pirate translations of his text, which appeared in the U.S. and also in Germany. And one, there were some, I guess, errors in the translations which were corrected in later editions, but what's interesting, what I think is super interesting, is that this group didn't simply translate the book, but they just took a lot of liberties with it. And the main one was that they added images, which are not in the French version. So there's no images in the French version. I don't think there's even an image on the cover if you see the original Society of the Spectacle in French. And these images they took from the Detroit Public Library image collection, which you can still go to. You look up the word like restaurant, and you will just get a manila folder with like cutout magazine pictures of restaurants. So they went and got pictures from the Detroit Public Library and then created these collages, and they the text is organized in these sort of little there's like these little entries, and so the group from Detroit just decided to like pair those entries with images that they thought like fit well. And you know, I think that it obviously it just like alters the way you read the text, because you're like, you almost read those texts as captions for the image. And I think it's very fitting, you know, like to have these images going with the text, but it's also just interesting that they just did that on their own. And then that image of the people in the glasses is also totally unauthorized, or it was like used without permission. It was an image from Life magazine. So there's a kind of a like raw energy, I feel like, with this first English translation, or the first edition, especially because you couldn't see that like they didn't really have control over the printing equipment yet. There's this line that hits the top of the letters there is not an ideal place for that line to hit, and like here, you can't really see it, but the text up at the top here is a little bit crooked, but they were just like, whatever, you know, I'll just do this collage, cut and paste. There's a kind of an energy, yeah, like here the crop at the bottom, that's a mistake for the printing. But they corrected all of those things later, and the images are also less prominent. But I think there's a kind of an energy that, that's sort of that I like. And then later, this was not printed by the printing co-op, but I just thought it's kind of an interesting counterpoint. Like for anyone who knows graphic design, graphic designers, this was designed by Bruce Mao, and this is the authorized translation that came out in 1994, and it's so much more kind of plain. So another, I will just cycle through like a few of these images of other books that Freddie Proman kind of designed and printed. This is the cover of a book called The Manual for Revolutionary Leaders. This is the book where these sort of portraits appear, and basically there's an entire section of the book where every paragraph starts with this enlarged letter over a portrait of a revolutionary leader, or of some kind of quote unquote revolutionary leader, and the whole book is supposed to be kind of a critique of the idea that you can have, that revolutions have leaders. So it's sort of critical of all of these people, but it goes from the current moment, or it goes in reverse chronological order, and so that's a detail. And a lot of the images are not necessarily. I didn't recognize this one as Mao, but other ones I couldn't really recognize. But as in terms of it's the kind of thing that I think as a graphic designer or as a typographer or typesetter, you wouldn't do unless you are also writing the text. Like that's a big move to make for the designer. So this is also something that it's also very time consuming. So it's interesting that he kind of carries this out over the course of I think it's like an 80-page section. So I just have a couple of those images here, but there's also collages in that book. This is and I also was sort of interested in the way he does collage, because it seems like he's also working as though everyone will recognize these images, but it's almost like speaking this secret language where you have to kind of know what the images are in order to understand what he means. But everything is sort of so subtle that I think most of 95% of people will not recognize these images. But this is a more recognizable one. This is Lenin, the outline of Lenin, and it's transposed on this. It's the reading room at the Beinecke Library at Yale. So I think there's some kind of there's like some message about Lenin and Yale and the training of revolutionary leaders. Here's just a couple other collages. And the other book that's also really interesting from a printing perspective is this book called The Incoherence of the Intellectual. A lot of times the covers are not that interesting compared to what's inside. But this is so he has these spreads with like large images that are sort of framed by these weird, weird kind of collages, and then also all of the section headings are these like type on a curve, have type going on a curve, which would have required the like letter set or the rub-off letters in order to kind of shape those curves. And he's just kind of, I would ask Lorraine Perlman, what's going on with this like bullseye thing on the image on the bottom, with the red kind of concentric circles, that Lorraine Perlman would say like, oh, he was just playing around, it doesn't really mean anything. So, but I was like, what is he doing there? The powerless intellectual. This is sort of a critique of academics as being kind of useless. Like, and kind of that are like, yeah, he sort of hated academics after his job at Western Michigan. The powerless intellectual. So, and then here are just a few other books. But Lorraine Perlman wrote of these early years of the printing co-op that she says, quote, Freddie was exhilarated by all aspects of the new activity, of the printing activity. He frequently asserted that never before had he felt so intellectually stimulated as he was by the challenges and gratifications he found in mastering the graphic arts equipment and techniques. And here are a couple of the other books. Later on, they acquired a binding machine, which I guess was pretty hard to use, but it made it possible for them to print these, more, do perfect binding more easily, these sort of soft cover books. These two books are actually really thick. They're like, one of them is like 700 pages. Just in closing, the books that Freddie Perlman printed over the years almost always include information about the labor and materials that went into their production. It's almost as if to call attention to every single step that goes into the production of each book, where the material is sourced from, how it got stapled, how it was stapled or sewn together, and by whom. He forefronts the labor that goes into the production of each object. So in this one, it says, the people who took part in the publication of the present work are neither publishers who invested capital in order to profit from the sale of a commodity on the book market, nor wage workers who produced a commodity in order to be paid for their time. So, yeah, I'll just sort of finish with this slide. So at a certain historical moment, like the time of all this minutiae in the 1500s, the role of the typesetter, printer, author, and publisher overlapped. As the work of the typesetter and the printer became separated from that of the publisher and the author, one worked with machines and the other worked with ideas. So printers fell more cleanly into the category of worker than thinker, but there's always been an overlap. And the philosopher Régis Degray has written about the role of the printer in the development of socialism. He describes the printer as, quote, quintessentially a worker intellectual or an intellectual worker, the very ideal of that human type who would become the pivot of socialism, the conscious proletarian. So although Freddie Perlman was primarily concerned with ideas, he didn't have any formal training in typography, printing, or bookmaking. He designed books that were more complicated and interesting to look at than was necessary. So I would argue that some of his experimental energy stemmed from the political and economic structure of the printing co-op itself, the decision not to work for wages or to monetize his time, and the concerted attempt to labor as a printer, but not for money, led to design and printing decisions that would not be rational in a for-profit environment structured according to the rules of capitalism. So that is what I'm thinking about, and that's my whole, that's the end.
Questions and comments, Dr. Smith?
So is this a book project? And I don't know where to begin, there's so much.
Complex.
I guess we could say more about how he hated Western Michigan University.
What happened there?
Ranked 14 in football. I guess maybe first the book project, and then more about the material conditions of the co-op and how that fit within the broader economic context as it changed.
Yeah. So when I applied for the Humanity Center grant, I was just thinking about doing this exhibition
Okay.
in Hamtramck because I wanted to look at this because there had been an exhibition 5 years ago of the work of Black and Red, but it was really like more from the ideas. I mean, the ideas are really important, but then I thought like it's so crazy, like the design of these things is sort of nuts. So
Yeah.
I wanted to do this kind of exhibition, but then as I was doing this, I thought like we should do some kind of book about it. I'm not really so comfortable with writing, a
Sure.
book length thing, but I think these. But I've been talking to all the people who were at the co-op, or like, people who remember, like there's all these kind of like interesting anecdotes and things related to it. So I think I would like to, or I am now like trying to, looking toward putting together a book. Also just to collect this because graphic design in Detroit has a kind of I'm trying to like kind of claim certain things
Yeah.
as like to be like this is graphic design, and I think this is kind of interesting to designers in other places. Especially this overlap. I think designers often are like, well, how are we political? How are we political?
Yeah.
Do we just make protest posters? And this is an interesting model.
There sounded like an implicit argument that there was not a relationship between the design in and of itself and the actual politics, but there was maybe the writing or the whole production of the book what had to do with the politics of the co-op, but the design was more experimental and not necessarily informed by techniques. Is that?
Yeah, no, I think that's what I said, but that's actually not the point I want to make because I want to
Okay.
kind of make the opposite point.
Okay.
But I'm glad,
Okay.
but I feel like but I think that's true. Like, I mean, because I'm sort of saying like, it doesn't have to be so complicated. But I feel like because of the way the co-op was set up, it's like it can be because he can make it complicated. And as a designer, when you're working on a client like a commission project,
Right.
it's like you cannot cut corners. Like you have to go to meetings, you have to answer emails, you have to deal with the printer. The things you can cut corners on are like the design part, So then that becomes like the part that you're spending less and less amount of time on. And I think in this case where they're kind of working not for money, that could get that could get stretched out to these crazy projects where you're like, oh, we're gonna just do a drop cap with the portrait, and also you have no clients, so no one's telling you like that doesn't make any sense. No one's gonna recognize that picture of this particular leader.
Exactly.
You know.
Okay, that makes more sense now.
But I think as far as the co-op, just about the story of the co-op, they did end up, like, the very early years was really exciting, and then they kind of closed down, and I think in 85 was when they finally, or no, maybe it was 80 was when they officially kind of closed up shop. And it's also around the time that a lot of print shops have been shutting down left and right, commercially or non-commercially, so it was just too much work, and then it was just cheaper for people to, like, pay someone else to print.
This is cool.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your time. When you showed those, I'll call them rubrics,
The like rules.
the opening, those letters superimposed on portraits. Okay. Because those letters form the first word of the paragraph. Yes.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the history of printing, the Union. Your first picture was of Benjamin Franklin's print shop. And since you're studying, and I was wondering, what was the crossover between the handwritten scriveners that produced works before the technology allowed for typeset printing? Did those scribes all?
Organize.
I mean, did they become the people that worked in print shops or the next stage in the development of the?
I don't know.
Union?
I don't know actually. That's an interesting question. Because all I know is that at the I think it took a while. Like Gutenberg developed printing, or in the West, movable type had already been used in China for many hundreds of years, but in the West, Gutenberg developed movable type to print the Bible, and he used the handwriting of the monks or the scribes to figure out, to design those earliest letter forms. But it wasn't like, I think it took a while for the transition to go into printing movable type. Although now that I'm saying that, all these minutiae was already printing a lot of books in the 1900s. So maybe the transition happened faster than. But I think, but yeah, I don't know that. I don't know. It's a different kind of work. So I don't know.
But at one point they would have had
They would have-
coexisted.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, are we actually currently right now using some of his experiments as models for our designs as well?
I mean, he's kind of not that well, he's not really not that he's not well known, but this is one of the questions I've been kind of asking a lot as I'm talking to people, is like at this time in Detroit, there was also Gary Grimshaw, who, and Carl Lundgren. They were making the posters for the MC5 or for the Grandee Ballroom, and it was all psychedelic, And then there was also around not too long after this period, Ed Fella is a graphic designer who's probably one of the most internationally known Detroit designers, but he didn't have most of his career in Detroit as a designer. But I keep asking did he have any crossover with those people? And apparently not. So and I think that he was just this guy just doing his thing. I mean, but he was, the one connection that's sort of interesting for people who know the Detroit situation more is this Joel Landy. If anyone knows Joel Landy, he's a real estate person. He owns he owns the Peterborough, the movie theater and everything. He was really into printing in the 70s and had his own print shop in Chicago. So he actually helped trained Freddie Croman. And he was using split fountain technique, which was this thing where you these kind of colors are kind of they kind of are the psychedelic colors, but they're not. This isn't those psychedelic people were all influenced kind of by Art Nouveau, and everything was sort of soft and round. So it's he's using similar colors and inks, but not to different effects. So you can kind of see, especially in that Yugoslavia book, maybe Joel Landy's influence. But Joel Landy then left printing and got really into collecting Jaguars and buildings in Midtown Detroit. So he's sort of oh, that was past life. But and the other, I mean, not to just ramble on, but the other thing that I think is interesting is the typeface at the bottom. That's Universe Italic, and a lot of their books have used Universe, and so I was also asking why they all use Universe, and I think that they had Universe and Times New Roman. Those were the balls they had for this electric machine. So yeah, it's also kind of, and they were well, it was modern, it looked modern, but yeah, it's kind of, I'm trying to, figure it out. Yeah.
So what was his interest in the Situationists? Was it just kind of political, or was he also interested in, detouring and the sort of the aesthetic aspect of Situationism?
I mean, I can't say, I haven't read all of his stuff, but my understanding is that it was really he just knew those guys. I mean, he was interested in Guy Debord, and he was interested to a certain extent in this Situationist ideas, but he was he didn't like that the Situationists were too kind of doctrinaire, or that they there were some Situationists who sort of argued with Freddie Croman and Laurie Croman and everything that they should they should only print Situationist stuff. So there's this big break with the Situationists where they were you're being too authoritarian or something, so he has the associations with them, but then there was that break after he came back from the States. So I think Yeah, I mean, even in this Guy Debord book, there's some kind of dig at the Situationists, where there's a section where Guy Debord talks about leaders or something, or like despots, and they put a picture of Guy Debord in there. But nobody gets it because we don't recognize. I don't know what Guy Debord looks like, but I mean, not nobody gets it, but so I think they liked it. But he was very cynical about any kind of organized anything. So yeah.
Can you explain more what you mean by printing collage?
Oh, so collage was more like, I think I was using that term a little bit like loosely, but collage is more like these kind of things where they would basically take, they would take an image and then like cut part of it and cut and paste it together, just like you would do collage with glue stick. But this was kind of not new, but this was really popular in the 60s or in the 70s. And like Lorraine Perlman said, collage was kind of in the air during that time. And I think this also has a lot to do with the ability to photograph stuff in order to print it. So it sort of has to do, before this, you see a lot of photo montage, coming out of here, but we were like in the U.S. we were kind of influenced by the Russian constructivists, and like the Bauhaus would do a lot, like Moholy-Nagy would do stuff with photo collage. But then at this point, it seems like it became cheaper, so anyone could kind of do collage.
Is it possible to catch like these works or like these books like outside of exhibit situation?
Yeah, they're not expensive. You can get them on eBay, and I haven't checked the Ruther or the Wayne State Library system, though I probably should, because I feel like I would guess that a lot of the black and red books would be here, and also at the Labadie collection and at U of M. But they're not like, that was the thing with the exhibition. We put them under this plexi, but they're not precious objects, so it's kind of just to protect them so that people didn't take them. But they're still pretty cheap because they were printed in high volume. But you can get Manual for Revolutionary Leaders for like probably $30 or something. Yeah.